Hello, Guilford Library community. Looks like we are live now. I'm Molly, and I am here at the library to share some tips about how to make your own pasta from home. This is something that I've done a number of times, both with or without a pasta machine, and it's something that's really fun to do. It's easy enough that you can do it with kids or teens. You can mix it up and try out different styles and different varieties, and it's just a lot of fun. I love pasta. I love eating it. I love making it. I'm really excited to share all of my creations with the rest of the staff here today, so that should be pretty fun. I'm going to start out with showing a couple of different ways to mix the dough. So you can mix it using a food processor if you have one at home. Only caution with the food processor is you want to try not to over mix it. So I'll show you just kind of use it to get the ingredients started. And then the really fun way that you probably see in a lot of cooking shows is to actually mix it on the table in front of you. So I'll show you both ways to do it. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to post them in the comments. I'll try to answer them as I go along. I can see that the stream is a little bit choppy due to the reception right now, so I'll try to kind of do everything slowly to make up for that lag in the video. So we're going to get started. A couple of tips if you're going to make your own pasta is to start with the right type of flour. There's a lot of different types of flour out there. One of the ones that's recommended the most when you're making pasta is 00 flour. So that's an Italian milled flour that's very fine. I could not find any, so I'm substituting for just basic all-purpose flour. No problem doing that. It just may take a little bit longer to cook, and it may be a little bit tougher than genuine, authentic Italian pasta. But I'm going for edible, not perfect, so that works out. The other ingredient that I use for the flour is semolina flour, and semolina flour is just a different type of flour, a different type of wheat, and it's also very finely ground. So semolina pasta dough tends to be very nice and smooth, very stretchy. It has a high protein, high gluten content, so it works very well. And I'm going to make up a batch, maybe a little bit of each, to kind of see which works the best. I know there are ways to make gluten-free pastas. I don't know how, so I'm going to stick with the gluten-free, or the gluten-filled with gluten pasta, but there are a lot of other recipes for pasta out there. So I'll post a couple of my main ones. The one that I'm going to really be using today is actually right on the back of my semolina flour package. This I just picked up at Hannaford. It's usually right in the flour section. Sometimes it's up next to the grits or polenta. Pretty easy to find. Salt, sea salt, table salt, very important. Olive oil. If you really like nice high quality olive oil, you can do the fancy stuff. Otherwise you can do just regular olive oil. And then finally, some water. Okay. So to make pasta dough in a food processor, also eggs. Eggs are very important for pasta. To make it in the food processor, depending on the size of the recipe, you may want to half it or quarter it, because sometimes the recipes will call for 2 or 3 cups of flour and a bunch of eggs. I have a very tiny food processor, so I'm going to do a much smaller batch. I've got my recipe, and all of the recipes will be shared in the comments as well. So I'm going to do it in half. So I'm going to start with my all-purpose flour, and I need 2 1/4 cups of flour. And again, for anyone just joining us, I'm using all-purpose flour because I couldn't find the 00 flour. They both will work, but if you can find 00 flour, it's great. You can get your hands on that. It's a really nice fine flour, works well for pasta, but it's whatever you can find. So I'm going to start with about 1 1/4 cups. So I'm just going to do 1 hefty cup. If you bake a lot, eyeballing I think is an okay thing to do. If you don't bake a lot, definitely try to go for those exact measures, because otherwise you'll end up with pasta that's very, very dry or too wet. Next, we're going to do about a teaspoon of salt. So I'm just using regular sea salt. You can use sea salt, table salt. I wouldn't do kosher salt because kosher salt tends to be very, very large flakes. So regular salt. Next, this recipe calls for 2 large eggs. And you'll find that depending on the recipe you use, some recipes will call for whole eggs, some will call for just a couple of whole eggs and egg whites. Others tend to be more heavy on just the yolks themselves. So they're all a little bit different. Certain types of pasta require different types of pasta dough that are more rich or a little bit more simple. We're going for just basic run-of-the-mill pasta dough right now. Next, we need 1 tablespoon of olive oil. So I'm just putting this all into the food processor. You'll see when we make it without the food processor that you have to be a little bit more patient adding the ingredients in little by little. So I have my 2 eggs, 1 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour, 1 tablespoon of olive oil, and a teaspoon of sea salt. So I mentioned earlier, if you're going to mix your pasta dough in a food processor, you want to just be careful that you don't overmix it. You're really just looking to get it to more of a crumbly mixed texture. Not totally blending it. It's not a cookie dough or a brownie batter. You want to be able to knead it afterward. So I'm just pulsing it until it gets to more of that crumbly consistency, but I'm not looking to blend it totally. I'll end up mixing it mostly with my hands for that. You also want to be working on a well-floured surface. I'm working on one of our plastic bridge tables, which is less than ideal, but it works for here. I recommend definitely a wooden surface. Tends to be nice because the pasta won't stick to the wooden surface as much, and the more flour you have down, especially if you have kind of a weird surface like this, the better. So I just sprinkle a little bit of that flour down, and we're going to pull this blended dough out. And it's a little sticky. It's definitely not like a liquid, but it's going to want to be dried out a little bit. Move this guy out of the way because we're done with the food processor. And now you're just going to start working the dough. So you don't want it to get too dry, so if you find that it's getting a little bit dry, you can use a little bit of olive oil to wet it down. But start working with it more because it may be more moist than you expect. So what I'm doing, I know the lag on the video is a little weird, I pull it in half, punch it down, and then rotate it a half turn. Pull it up, punch it down, rotate it a half turn. Up, down, rotate. And you'll want to knead this dough for about 10 minutes. I'm not going to do that right now because I did the Food Network thing and I have some dough ready to go. So that's our food processor dough. So I'm going to set this one aside. I'll keep kneading it and I'll finish it for later. But I did make up a batch in just the food processor. And we're going to do a little comparison. What worked better, the food processor batch or the hand rolled batch? After you get it kneaded, you want it to sit for at least a half hour. The longer, the better, but at least a half hour. It needs that time to allow all of the gluten in that dough to activate, and it's going to make that dough so much stretchier and easier to work with. If I tried to roll this as it is right now, it's just going to tear. Where as a comparison, after it's been sitting for a half hour, I have this really, really nice, elastic, soft dough that's actually going to want to stretch. So if you find that if you make pasta at home and it's tearing, you may not have let it sit long enough, or you might need to knead it more. So the longer you let it sit, the better. We're going to wait for that to sit a little bit, and then we're going to do the fun way of mixing pasta dough. So this is the kind of traditional way that a lot of people will do it. I'm going to mix it up a little bit and try some of this semolina flour with this recipe as well. Move some things out of the way. And there's tons of videos on YouTube for how to do your own pasta. There's a lot of examples of all the different types of pasta you can make, different techniques for it. You can add food coloring or food dyes to change the way that the pasta looks or tastes. We're going for just basic. So this is the recipe that's on the back of the semolina package. So I'm going to do 1 cup of the semolina flour. And the semolina is very, very fine. It's almost like a beach sand consistency. So I'm going to do a cup of the semolina, and I'm pouring that just right into a pile on the table in front of me. And we're going to do 1 cup of the all-purpose flour. So normally this would be 00 flour. All-purpose works just as well. We're going to kind of mix those two flours together a little bit. It's kind of like being at the beach and making a sandcastle, but you can eat it afterward. And we're going to make a well kind of in the middle here. See if I can move the camera so we can see this a little bit more for a second. So you'll see I just kind of have a well. It almost looks like a nest. So you've got higher sides that are about 1 inch or so high, and then that deeper well in the middle. Okay. Next, we're going to use 2 whole eggs and 1 egg white. So I mentioned some of the recipes call for whole eggs, some call for just egg yolk, some call for a combination. This one is 2 whole eggs and 1 egg white. And we're going to crack them right into that center well right there. And if you find that your well starts filling up a little bit and you're worried about those eggs spilling over, just grab a fork. You can kind of widen that well out a little bit. And we're going to do 1 egg white. So I have a little cup here I'm going to separate out with. Next, the recipe calls for 3 tablespoons of water. I'm going to start with just 1 and start kind of mixing this in because I'm getting a lot of liquids in here and I don't want this to spill all over the library meeting room. So I'm just using a regular fork. I recommend a fork over a whisk because this dough tends to get very sticky and a whisk can get gummed up very quickly. But you're basically just stirring in the middle and you're picking up some of that dry flour from around the outside edge of that well and mixing this into a nice dough. The more it gets incorporated, we can add more of our liquids. So I added 1 tablespoon of water. I'm going to add 2 more. And then this will also call for 2 tablespoons of olive oil. But again, I'm going to mix some of this in a little bit more so that we don't start spilling out of that well. It's not the end of the world if you make a mess, it's just a little easier to manage. This is also the point where if you were coloring your pasta dough in any way, you could add some colorants to it. People have added, a spinach pulp. People have added, beet juice. You can do a lot of pretty cool things with coloring the pasta. I just posted a video on the Facebook group, community art group through the library, and there's an artist in Seattle, artist and chef, who colors all of her pasta and then she layers it up almost like paper crafts or quilting, and she does these absolutely beautiful types of pasta with all kinds of different layered colors and flavors. So you can see here the advantage of being able to do it in the food processor. This is fun. It's a little bit more of the traditional way to do it, but it does take a little longer. One last tablespoon of olive oil to add. And then I need a little bit of salt. And again, no matter how you mix it, you're going to want to let that dough rest for at least a half hour to get all of those glutens activated. So it'll be a lot easier to stretch and run through the machine. So as I start to come together, I'm going to switch over to using a bench scraper here. You can use a bench scraper, you can use even a credit card, but just something to kind of help incorporate this a little bit more. Let's see if we can get that angle right. And we're just scraping and kind of chopping and getting that all mixed together. I would definitely recommend checking out some of the YouTube videos on pasta making. The buffering might be a little bit better, a little bit clearer. And you can see how the professionals do it. So this is starting to come together, so I'm going to start mixing it a little more with my hands. Just going to get this incorporated enough that I can set it aside, and then we'll move on to rolling out the dough and making the actual pasta. I'll share a recipe in the comments as well for one of my favorite types of pasta sauce. I feel like if you're making your own pasta, to just make your own pasta sauce too and add that on is just kind of that cherry on top. And pasta sauce is one of those things that's also surprisingly easy. Just crushed tomatoes, some garlic, basil, a little bit of seasoning, and olive oil. So you can see this is kind of coming together, but it's still very crumbly. I'm not going to continue to mix this one because I want to get to actually making the pasta, so we'll let that sit and I'll finish that one up later. And I have my pre-made dough ready to go. So we'll start with the pasta machine because that's a little bit more fun. So pasta machine, it's a really handy tool. It's very easy to use. Mine is just a traditional old-fashioned crank machine. It clamps down to the top of the table. You can get electric ones that will actually run the dough through itself, or you can get attachments for like a KitchenAid mixer. We're going the regular way. Keeping a floured surface, and I'm just going to start with taking a smaller piece. And we're going to run this through a number of times. So there's a couple of different rollers here. One will flatten it out, the other will cut it into the strips. We want to start with flattening this one ball of clay, or ball of pasta dough. You don't want to try to run this whole thing through it at once. Then take the small amount, and we're going to work, they have numbers on them, 7 down to 1, so we're going to start with a 7 and then work our way down. And just start running this through. So you can see how much that changed just with one pass through. You want to keep your dough nice and floured through all of this so that it doesn't get too dry and try to stick to itself. And we're starting with just a very basic, probably linguine on this one. I think basic noodles, you can do so much with them, and they taste good. So each pass through that I do, it's getting longer, it's getting thinner. You can always cut this in half if you find that it gets a little bit unruly and harder to work with. And I'm down to, I think, a 3 now. I'm going to probably keep going down to a 2 or even a 1 and just do some nice thin linguine pasta. Fresh pasta I think is best if you eat it as soon as you make it. So you can have some boiling water going on the stove while you're rolling out your pasta dough. It's starting to stick a little bit, so I'm going to add some flour. But you can actually freeze or refrigerate homemade pasta for quite a while as well. I'm going to do one last pass through and then we'll run some linguine. This is very helpful if you have an assistant, a child, grandchild, somebody that can help you with this process. So that has been rolled down to a 1. So I have very, very nice thin sheets of pasta dough. They're nice and stretchy. I was able to get that thin because this pasta dough has been sitting and resting since this morning. So definitely good to let it rest because it'll be so much stretchier. I'm going to cut it in half before I run it through the linguine because I don't really want super, super long linguine, and it's going to be a lot easier to work with having these shorter pieces. So I've got 2 settings up in the second portion of the pasta machine that have these little cutting blades. So one is a lot wider for the linguine, the other is much finer for angel hair pasta. Another thing, definitely make sure that you're plenty well floured before you cut them smaller because you don't want your pasta sticking together. And I'm just slowly rolling this through as the linguine comes out the bottom. So I've got lots and lots of threads here. I may have rolled mine a little bit too thin because I'm finding that they don't want to come apart as much, but they'll still taste good. You can kind of take some time and pull the strands apart and make a little bundle here as well. And as far as I know, there's no official, linguine can be certain lengths or whatever works. You can make really, really long sheets and then cut them down. You can run just smaller portions through at a time. It's entirely up to you, as long as they are really well floured, so that after they come out of the machine, and I can add a little bit of fresh flour down here, you're going to toss it so that you have a little pile ready to go. I'm going to do one more strip through with the linguine. And angel hair pretty much works the same way. It's just going to be a much finer, more like a spaghetti. Again, just pulling apart these strands a little bit, tossing them in some fresh flour so that they don't stick. Then we'll switch over and I'll show you how you can actually roll pasta and cut it with a pizza cutter at home. So not everybody has a pasta machine. Sometimes if you keep an eye on thrift stores, you can find them there, or friends and family may have them sitting in a cupboard somewhere. So we'll let that linguine just rest for a little bit. I'm going to take another piece of dough here, cut it out. Actually, before I even roll it, you can do a lot just by pinching pieces and rolling it by hand. So if I take a small piece, it's just like working with clay. You can actually roll pieces. There's different mats you can use to do like gnocchi and all kinds of other techniques. So if you this one doesn't really want to roll very well because I'm working on a plastic table. But if you're rolling on a wooden surface, that works pretty well. So I've got a little bit of a log of pasta dough right here, and I'm just going to cut it into little chunks. These little pieces you can work with, you can add texture to them. It's all pasta. There's a whole lot of science, there's a whole lot of culture that goes into different types of pasta. This is pasta a la library, I guess. But they're kind of fun, little small pieces that once they cook up could be pretty good. Or you can continue to roll them and make different types of hand-shaped pasta. So I'll do a couple of these, just kind of rolling and twisting. If you have a dowel, you can roll these onto a dowel and get a really nice twist to them. But these are just kind of fun, chunky, swirly spaghetti. That's what I mean by you can have a lot of fun with it. You can work with kids, you can work with teens. If you're making different types of pasta, just keep in mind that pasta will cook at different rates depending on how thick it is. So if you have a bunch of these little thick chunks, maybe don't put that in with your spaghetti or your linguine. But you could cook them just fine on their own. I usually like to have more smaller pots of water if I'm going to cook up a bunch of pasta, because I tend to make a lot of different types. So instead of having one great big pot that I have to boil, I'll do smaller amounts and have 3 or 4 just small pans going, because then I can put tortellini in one, I can put ravioli in the other, I can put linguine in another one, and then whatever these funny little twists are that I'm making. Now if you want to make something like linguine or angel hair pasta or any of those longer noodles and you don't have a pasta machine, all you need is a rolling pin and either something like a bench scraper or a sharp knife, or if you have a pizza cutter, that works great. We're almost done with these guys. You'll see you get quite a bit of pasta out of one batch of dough. So this was one of those, it was 2.5 cups of flour that went into the food processor, and it's going to end up making a pretty good amount. So I'm going to take another smaller portion. Move the pasta machine over a little. And I'll usually have a cookie sheet or something, a floured cookie sheet that I can put all of my finished pasta onto. So then I can just carry that right over to the stove and it'll be ready to cook. Grab my rolling pin. And I'm just going to flatten this down and try to get it rolled as smoothly as I can. Move some of my pasta around. And you may find that you have more luck rolling on a wooden surface. A plastic bridge table is not the best, but I can make something. Making sure that that surface stays floured, because as you stretch that pasta dough out, it is going to want to stick some. Alright, so my dough's getting pretty thin. It's probably at about a 2 or 3 on the pasta machine scale, which I think is probably good enough. So once I have that rolled out, nice floured surface, take my pizza cutter, and we're just going to pretty much cut noodles however wide you want them. You'll see in the YouTube videos that a lot of professional pasta makers have these really cool tools that just look like a whole bunch of pizza cutters all together. Pizza cutter or a sharp knife works great. So then that is just hand rolled and cut noodles. So these are pretty wide noodles. You could definitely go much thinner, but that just shows you what you can do just with a rolling pin and a pizza cutter. So you may be wondering about, what about raviolis or some of those, fancier, thinner pastas? Those you can do either with the machine or even by hand. So I'm going to roll some out through the machine right now. I'll get another fresh piece of dough. I think it's fun to experiment with different types of pasta dough as well. So this one has more of that semolina in it, which is a different type of dough. It has a little bit of a chewier texture, and it's definitely a lot stretchier. So I think that could be fun. I'm going to cut this portion in half too, so I can show you both rolling and through the machine. Oh, and you know what I didn't do? Start with the highest setting first. So we're going to go to a 7. So what happened with that was it tried to squish too much, and you have to very slowly and carefully stretch it. So I'm going to start with a 7 and run that through. And just slowly get it thinner and thinner. And the same thing when you're rolling it out by hand. Don't try to just wail on it and go as thin as you can right off the bat. Start a little bit thicker, roll it, coat it with some flour, and just keep making it smaller and smaller. And again, if you find that it's getting very long and a little bit hard to manage as you run it through the machine, you can always cut that piece of pasta in half and just do smaller portions. If you have somebody helping you that can hold it at one end, that definitely helps. So we're almost down to where I would fill it with some pasta filling. You can do ground meats, you can do even chopped seafood, regular old ricotta cheese with some herbs and chopped spinach. I will say that ravioli and tortellini takes a little bit more time and patience and practice, because if the edges aren't sealed, sometimes the pasta can kind of explode in the pot and it's a mess, but still tastes pretty good. So I'm down to a very, very thin sheet right here. And just as an example, I'm just going to use a different chunk of pasta dough to show you what you would do with a filling. So we're going to lay out our tortellini. I'm going to cut this down with my pizza cutter so that it's in a really nice, even rectangle. It'll just make it a lot easier when I'm trying to measure to make the little raviolis themselves, the little tortellini. So if I were going to make tortellini or ravioli or some kind of a filled pasta, again, I don't have a filling, but I'm just going to use some little balls of extra pasta dough to demonstrate how you would do that. You kind of visually space them out, and depending on how damp or wet your pasta dough is, you may or may not need to do water around it. Mine's pretty sticky, so I think I'm probably going to be okay. I'm going to cut these into little squares with whatever filling you would do. Let's see if we can get this. And then you're going to kind of fold that pasta into a pocket around that filling and pinch it tight, like you're making a little purse, a little packet. And you want to pinch it nice and tight. If you find that your pasta is a lot drier and you're not able to just kind of pinch it shut like that, you can wet your finger just a little bit and kind of run that around the outside edge of the pasta, and that'll help things come together. Don't put too much, but just a little tiny bit. So this is my little imitation ravioli. So that's just with the filling tucked to the inside like that, and just making sure that those edges are sealed. So if you need to wet your pasta dough down a little bit so that it sticks a little better, you can do that. There's a lot of different ways that you can make filled pastas. So you could pinch everything up into more of a dumpling type shape. It's really whatever shape you want to do, as long as those edges are sealed. You could fold in a couple of edges and pinch the outside so it looks more like a twisted piece of candy or a wrapped piece of candy. And online, on YouTube videos, there's tons and tons and tons of other examples of how to make different filled pastas. So you can kind of have fun with it. With your regular sheets, there's a lot of other just rolled pastas that you can do. So we'll just do a couple of these real quick. So you roll out your sheet of pasta, whether it's with your pasta machine or just rolling it nice and thin with your rolling pin. This is not paper thin, but like a thick cardstock thin, like a construction paper or cardstock. And I'm just going to go right through and cut kind of in rectangles. And I'm going to pinch these into little bow tie shapes. So I have that little rectangle shape, and I'm just going to do a couple of pinches in the middle. So this is where doing pasta with kids can be really fun, because very creative, very think outside the box way to make different types of pasta. So those are little bow tie shapes. So there's a lot of different ways that you can work with it. So once you have your pasta made and it's nice and floured, it's been sitting here for a while, you'll want to just drop it carefully into a pot of salted boiling water. You definitely want to salt your pasta water. It just helps with the cooking process. It helps keep those noodles from sticking to each other. I think it just helps the pasta taste much better. So I usually recommend, especially with something like all of this linguine that I made, if I drop this entire thing in, I would end up with just a noodle ball. So as you're dropping it into the pot, just kind of lightly separate it with your fingers and shake it in. And this is where making smaller batches of pasta at a time in smaller pots of water is definitely going to help better than having that gigantic pot of water. So yeah, I'm going to share a couple of links for some of the recipes, some of the books that I use when I'm looking for recipes for making pasta. I'll share a couple of YouTube videos with some other examples of how to make pasta, and then also a really, really good pasta sauce recipe. So if you have any other questions, feel free to send the Guilford Library a message. Again, this is Molly. I'd be happy to help with any questions that come up. If you try making pasta yourself and you want to share some images of your work, whatever your creations look like, I'd love to see what you guys experiment with. So thanks for joining me on Facebook Live. I'm going to go make a bunch more pasta so that we all can have some lunch today. So thanks, everybody, and happy cooking.